The Villisca Axe Murders, 8 lives lost in one night. Key point. On the 10th of June 1912, 8 people were found brutally murdered in the Moore family home in Villisca, Iowa. Parents Josiah B. Moore, 43, and Sarah Montgomery Moore, 39, their 4 children, Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, 7, and Paul Vernon, 5. Plus 2 overnight guests, sisters Ina Mae Stillinger, 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 12. This mass murder, committed with the family's own axe while all victims slept, remains completely unsolved after 112 years, and stands as Iowa's most notorious crime. Villisca was a thriving town with a close-knit community of around 2,500 residents in southwestern Iowa. Although there were only 2,500 residents in Villisca, it was a hub for developing businesses and a magnet for local tycoons who were eager to capitalize on the area's growth. In addition to the many businesses, Villisca also featured a National Guard armory, funded entirely by the local residents, the first of its kind on U.S. soil. Josiah Moore was one of the town's most prominent businessmen who had secured a franchise to the booming John Deere Company. Previously, he'd worked 9 years for Frank Jones, the owner of a hardware and agricultural supply store and a state politician. Moore set up shop directly across the street from his former boss. The Moore family was deeply interwoven into the fabric of the community. An affluent family, the Moores were well known and well liked in their community. Josiah married Sarah Montgomery on December 6 of 1899 at the home of her parents. Like the extended Moore family, they had moved to Villisca from Illinois. The couple were regular church attendees, with Sarah serving as co-director of church programs. The Stillinger sisters came from a wealthy farming family living 7 miles outside town. 2 friends of Catherine's were part of the special program, Ina Mae Stillinger, 8, and her sister, Lena Gertrude, 12. The sisters were members of a wealthy family who lived on a large farm about 7 miles outside of town. On Sunday, June 9th, the family and the Stillinger sisters attended a special evening children's program at the newly constructed Presbyterian Church, just a 5-minute walk from the Moore house. The Children's Day service was an end-of-the-year Sunday school program. Sarah Moore was a co-director, and her children performed their little speeches and recitations, along with the other Sunday school members. Around 6 p.m., Josiah called the Stillinger family home and asked their oldest sister, Blanche, if the girls could stay overnight. Permission was granted for what would be a tragic sleepover. After the program ended at 9:30 p.m., the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moores' house, arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The service ended with a social mingling that lasted until at least 9:30 p.m. When parishioners left on that cloudy, damp, and cool night, no one suspected that neither the Moores nor their overnight guests would be seen alive again. The Moores had added a twin bed into the downstairs sewing room so that Catherine, their only daughter, could sleep with the Stillinger girls. The Stillinger girls slept there, wedged together in a single twin bed. Catherine joined her brothers in an upstairs bedroom next to their parents. The family settled in for what they thought would be a peaceful night's sleep. 2 spent cigarettes in the attic suggested that the killer or killers patiently waited in the attic until the Moore family and the Stillinger guests were asleep. Doctors concluded that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m., most experts narrowing the time frame to between midnight and 2 a.m., on the 10th of June 1912. Sometime after midnight, someone wielding an axe attacked J.B. first. Sarah was next, and like the rest of the victims, she was bludgeoned only with the blunt end of the axe. The killer or killers began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore were sleeping. Josiah received more blows from the axe than any other victim. His face had been cut so much that his eyes were missing. The ceiling above his body had a gouge mark from when the murderer raised the axe. Leaving the parents dead, the murderer went into the adjacent room and killed the 4 more children, then headed down to the parlor bedroom where he killed the Stillinger sisters. Investigators believed that Lena Stillinger may have awakened before she was killed. Her body was lying crosswise on the bed, and she had a defensive wound on her arm. The other 7 victims appeared to have been asleep when the blows fell. Then, in a chilling encore, the murderer went back upstairs and savagely attacked the already dead bodies of the Moore family, whacking Josiah an estimated 30 times and rendering the other victims' faces unidentifiable with further beating. He took such ferocious swings, it left marks on the walls and ceilings. After the murders, the killer performed bizarre rituals. Then, the killer walked around the home, ritualistically covering all the mirrors, a common practice during wakes and funerals at the time, and covered the victims with pieces of cloth or clothing. He closed all the window blinds, and on the 2 windows without them, draped pieces of the family clothing. He returned to the girl's room downstairs, where he left the ox, believed taken from the Moore's own coal shed, and leaned it up against the wall. He washed his hands in a pail of water, made himself a plate of beans, and tucked into some bread before he left, locking the door with a house key behind him around 5 a.m. At 7 a.m. the next day, June 10, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, became concerned after she noticed that the family had not come out to do their morning chores. By this time, Mary's neighbors would be bustling too. However, their house was silent besides the impatient mooing of their cows. Peckham knocked on the Moore's door. When nobody answered, she tried to open the door and discovered that it was locked. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out and called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Ross Moore arrived and used his copy of the house key to enter. Upon entering, he discovered the horrific scene. All 8 occupants had been brutally murdered with an axe. Moore immediately told Peckham to call Hank Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, who arrived shortly thereafter. Horton's search of the house revealed that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death. The crime scene was immediately compromised. After the bodies were found, there was no protection of the crime scene and evidence. Quite the contrary. Villisca townspeople tramped through the house for over 24 hours between the discovery of the murders and the removal of the 8 victims. By some accounts, as many as 100 people had trampled through the crime scene before it was secured by the Villisca National Guard around noon on June 10. Remarkably, the coroner called the jury together and began the inquest on the 11th of June, 1912, just 2 days after the murders had taken place. A total of 14 witnesses were called to testify at the inquest, including Mary Peckham, the neighbor who raised the alarm, Ed Selly, an employee of Josiah who had arrived to take care of the animals, and J. Clark Cooper, the first doctor to enter the house following the discovery. The Moore Stillinger funeral services were held in Villisca's town square on the 12th of June, 1912, with thousands in attendance. National Guardsmen blocked the street as a hearse moved toward the firehouse, where the 8 victims lay. Their caskets, not on display during the funeral, were later carried on several wagons to the Villisca Cemetery for burial. The funeral cortege was 50 carriages long. The murders spawned nearly 10 years of investigations, repeated grand jury hearings, a spectacular slander suit and murder trial, and numerous minor litigations and trials. The horrific crime made and broke political careers. Legislation was written in response to the murder, including the establishment of the current State Bureau of Criminal Investigation's predecessor. The investigation produced multiple suspects but no convictions. At 5:19 a.m., the morning following the murders, the Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly left Villisca on board the westbound No. 5 train and allegedly told fellow travelers there were 8 dead souls back in Villisca, Iowa, butchered in their beds while they slept, he said, even though the bodies had not yet been discovered. Kelly was tried twice for the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury and the second ended in an acquittal. Other suspects in the investigation included Frank F. Jones, a state senator and Moore's former employer who had business rivalries with Josiah. William Mansfield murdered his wife, daughter, and parents-in-law in a way that was eerily similar to the Moore family murders. Henry Lee Moore was convicted of murdering his mother and maternal grandmother just months after the Villisca murders. His weapon of choice was an axe, yet none were ever convicted. The case inspired broader investigations into similar crimes. 9 months before the murders at Villisca, a similar case of axe murder occurred in Colorado Springs, Colorado. 2 axe murder cases followed in Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paola, Kansas. The cases were similar enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person. In their 2017 book, The Man from the Train, Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James discuss the Villisca murders as part of a much larger series of murders which they believe were all committed by a single serial killer. Their theory suggests a traveling serial killer was responsible for multiple similar crimes across the Midwest. The impact on Villisca was permanent. While Villisca still possesses the same small-town charm and appeal it did over 100 years ago, its legacy is forever tainted by the events of June 1912. To this day, the Villisca axe murders continue to haunt the small town. Today, the house is a tourist destination in the small rural Iowa town of Villisca. A couple had purchased the home in 1995 and undone all the modern renovations to the house, restoring it to 1912 condition. The house now operates as a museum and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, attracting thousands of visitors annually who come to learn about this unsolved mystery. To this day, no one has been found guilty for the murders, and most likely never will be, since it has been over 100 years. The Villisca axe murders remain the most notorious murders in Iowa's history. The case has influenced modern forensic procedures, crime scene management, and law enforcement protocols, serving as a stark reminder of how far investigative techniques have advanced since 1912. The 8 victims, the Moore family, and the Stillinger sisters, are remembered not just as victims of an infamous unsolved crime, but as real people whose lives were tragically cut short. Their story continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts, paranormal investigators, and historians more than 112 years after that terrible night in June 1912. On the night of June 9–10, 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, 8 people were brutally murdered with an axe while they slept. The victims were the Moore family, Arthur parents, Josiah, 43, and Sarah, 39, their 4 children, Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5, plus 2 young friends, sisters Ina, 8, and Lena, 12, Stillinger, who were staying overnight. The family had attended a church program that evening and returned home around 9:45 p.m., sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. An unknown killer entered the house and bludgeoned all 8 victims to death with the family's own axe. The killer then covered mirrors, draped clothing over windows, ate food, and locked the door when leaving. The bodies were discovered the next morning when neighbor Mary Peckham noticed the unusually quiet house and called Josiah's brother Ross, who found the horrific scene. Despite a lengthy investigation that lasted nearly a decade, multiple suspects, including Reverend George Kelly, businessman Frank Jones, and serial killer William Mansfield, 2 trials, and even confessions, no one was ever convicted. The case remains unsolved after 112+ years. The house still stands today as a museum and is considered one of America's most famous unsolved murder cases. The Villisca axe murders remain Iowa's most notorious crime. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.